Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and today I'm going to be doing my December wrap-up. So today I thought I would talk about all the books that I read in the month of December. So in December I read 16 and a half books, let's say, though 3 of them were unpublished books that I read for work, so I can't talk about those 3, but I do have 13 and a half books to talk about, so let's get on with them. The half one we'll start with is War and Peace. I'm still reading War and Peace. I didn't manage to finish it in December, but I'm hoping I will finish it in January, and if not, I will finish it at the very beginning of February. It's very long, guys, it's very long. I am 75% the way through now, and I am really enjoying it. Though I will say I don't think I love it as much as Anna Karenina. And in general, I really like the characterisation and some of the peace bits, but I don't like all of the war stuff. I find that sometimes quite dry, and I think it's too long. Like, I'm just gonna go out there and say I think it's too long. I don't think it needs to be that long. Quite often I read a chapter and I'm like, this didn't really add anything to the book. I don't know, like, I am still really enjoying it, and I still really like the characters and find the characterisation really interesting. But I think it will be a 4-star, not a 5-star read for me, if you see what I mean. But I am still reading it, and I am really enjoying it, so there we go. And also in December I read a section of this book, so I suppose maybe it should have been 15 and 2 half books. Anyway, this is Christmas Stories from Household Words. So this is a collection of all of the Christmas editions of Dickens's magazine Household Words that he ran between 1850 and 1858. So every year they published a Christmas edition full of Victorian Christmas short stories. So I read the 1850 edition this year, and next year I intend to read the 1851 edition. So there were quite a few stories in the 1850 edition. I need to consult my list because there were no bylines in Household Words, so you don't know who wrote them unless you look it up online. It takes quite a lot of digging, but I did find them out. So in this collection there was A Christmas Tree by Charles Dickens, Christmas in Lodgings by William Blanchard Gerald and William Henry Wills, Christmas in the Navy by James Hannay, A Christmas Pudding by Charles Knight, Christmas Among the London Poor and Sick by Frederick Knight Hunt, Christmas in India by J. Mitch Hayward Sinnons, Christmas in the Frozen Regions by Dr. Robert McCormack and Charles Dickens, Christmas Day in the Bush by Samuel Sidney, and Household Christmas Carols by R.H. Horne. Now, it was interesting, I thought they would all be Christmas fiction stories, but actually it's a mixture of like short stories and articles, I suppose, in some ways. I'm not sure if all of the editions were like that. My favourites are probably A Christmas Tree by Charles Dickens, which is kind of just like a reflection on childhood Christmases, which I really enjoyed. I also found Christmas in Lodgings really fun and really funny. It's about a man who is like on his own for Christmas in lodgings, and very cross about the fact that his landlady feels very sorry for him for being on his own at Christmas. It was really good fun. It was also really interesting to read Christmas in India, Christmas in the Frozen Regions, and Christmas Day in the Bush, where it looks at like Christmas in different parts of the British Empire / the world, which I found really interesting. It was certainly a very interesting read and quite Christmassy, and I'm looking forward to reading the next edition of Household Words next Christmas and kind of carrying on with this as a long-term project. Carrying on into 20th century classics, I read They Do It With Mirrors by Agatha Christie. I don't have a copy of this because I gave it back to the library, but this I read for the Cloak and Dagger Christmas readathon, and I really enjoyed it. I really love Agatha Christie. I wanted to pick up Miss Marple, and this one was the one that my library had most readily available. It was really interesting and quite fun. Miss Marple is summoned by one of her friends to keep an eye on this friend's sister, a woman who Miss Marple knew well a very long time ago but hasn't seen for a while. This is another elderly lady who Miss Marple goes to visit to find out what's going on in their house, and of course there is a murder and some scandal and so on. I really enjoyed this one. It was a really engaging Agatha Christie read. And also, interestingly, it was the first Agatha Christie that I have correctly worked out the solution of. I've never managed to guess correctly the solution of an Agatha Christie before, but I did get this one, so that was interesting. I also read 2 more of Anthony Powell's series, A Dance to the Music of Time, in December. The first was The Military Philosophers, which is the last of that series set in the Second World War. I made a full video on this, so I won't talk about it much here, and I'll link that video down below. And also it's part of a series, so it's quite hard to discuss at this point. But it's a really interesting book set in the latter part of World War II. And then I also read Books Do Furnish a Room, which is the 10th book in the series, which I also really enjoyed. This is set in the late 40s / maybe early 50s, and it's quite interesting that it looks quite a lot like the publishing industry and the bookish world of that time, which I found really interesting too. It was a really good read. There will be a full video coming up on this for the people who are taking part in the read-along, and that'll appear at some point in January. Moving on to contemporary fiction. In December I read The Invisible Circus by Jennifer Egan. This I borrowed from a friend, so I've given that back now and don't have a copy to show you, but I really enjoyed this one. It was really engaging. I love Jennifer Egan. She's a real favourite modern author of mine, and one I definitely need to read more by and kind of get through all her backlist. The Invisible Circus tells the story of a young woman whose sister sister died when she was a child, and her sister died while travelling abroad in Europe, and now the main character decides to go from America to Europe to visit all the places that her sister visited before she died, to see if she can kind of like solve the mystery of her sister's suicide and what led her to it. It was really, really engaging and really, really interesting. It's set in the 70s, and I found that kind of exploration of 70s Europe really, really interesting. I also found the kind of main character and her complex relationship with her dead sister really interesting as well. In general, it was a really engaging and great read. I don't think it would be my favourite Jennifer Egan. I think in terms of her novels, I prefer Manhattan Beach more, and also Emerald City, her short story collection, will always be my favourite thing by her, I think, because it's so amazing. But it was definitely worth a read, and I really need to read more by Jennifer Egan in the future. I then also read When All Is Said by Anne Griffin, which I really enjoyed. This is a proof copy, which Sceptre very kindly sent to me, and this should be out, I think, at the end of January. This tells the story of an elderly man, Maurice, kind of looking back over the course of his life. It's got a really lovely narrative structure. Throughout the book, Maurice is kind of sat at a hotel bar, and in his head he's talking to his son, who is not present. His son lives abroad. And the book is kind of structured as 5 toasts to 5 like important people throughout the course of his life. It's not chronological, but over the course of it you get like a growing sense of Maurice's life over time. Maurice is a really interesting character for being... He's not dislikable exactly. It's not that he's not a nice man. It's just that he isn't a man who has always been nice, and his life has sometimes been a little too much driven by his desire for money. And the way the book kind of explores that and his relationship with his wife and son is really, really interesting. There are some really moving and beautiful passages in here, and I found it a really compelling read. It reminded me quite a lot of Tin Man by Sarah Winman. I can't really tell you why, because it's not that the themes are exactly similar, but there's just something about the tone and writing style of it that reminded me quite a lot of Tin Man. So I think if you like Tin Man, you would definitely like When All Is Said. This was a really interesting and moving read, and definitely a book I would recommend. I then also read Mrs. Gasp Got the Me by Nell Stevens. This is also a review copy which Picador very kindly sent to me, and I loved this book a lot. I don't really know how to talk about this book. I can't remember the last time I have cried so much after reading a book. And I don't mean like slight tears in my eyes. I might have to close the book and look away to make sure I don't cry on the train. That's like every other book I read. I mean, like, I finished this book and I wept for like a full 5 minutes, which I don't think I've done since I read The Casual Vacancy by J.K. Rowling quite a long time ago. But I don't even know why, because it's not like it's an incredibly sad book. I think I just had like a really big emotional connection with this book in a way that is very personal, but also just meant that I like completely fell in love with it in so many ways. So it tells the story of a woman called Nell who is doing a PhD on English literature, specifically on Elizabeth Gaskell and a few other writers and artists who met together in Rome at a certain point in the 19th century. And the book is kind of a dual narrative. Part of it is Nell in the present day writing her PhD and also kind of working out the complications of having a long-term relationship with a man who is from America but living in Paris and she is living in London. That's half the story, and the other half is about Elizabeth Gaskell and a few other different characters in the Victorian period, and specifically focusing on Elizabeth Gaskell's relationship with a man who she met in Rome, who was some years younger than herself and whom she had a close friendship with. I just really loved it. I think it's partly just the way that Nell Stevens writes about the love of books and the love of literature, which reminded me in some ways of The 13th Tale. Not that this book is anything really like The 13th Tale, but they both are books that really write about the love of literature in a wonderful way. And there's a bit where she's writing about reading Elizabeth Gaskell as a teenager and just like being so compelled and just like falling in love with her work, which I just think that just spoke to me a lot as a great fan of Elizabeth Gaskell. And I also really liked the portrait that was presented of Elizabeth Gaskell in this book, as I wasn't sure I would, because Elizabeth Gaskell was married and had this kind of close friendship with this younger man, which from what I had heard about this book I thought might be like really over romanticised, sexualised, like pretending they had an affair when they didn't, but actually it's more just like looks at her affection for this man and her love for this man, which came to a friendship and nothing more, which I just thought was really, really nicely and wonderfully done. And I now really want to track down like a biography of Elizabeth Gaskell or her letters and just find out more about her life, because I love her work so much, but I don't know that much about her life, and this book was a really nice insight into that. But I actually think I preferred the present day story to the past historical story, because I found the main character so compelling and her love of literature. Nell's in her late 20s and worrying not just about kind of relationships but also worrying about wanting to have children. There's just so much in this book that was so moving and powerful and that I just loved, and yeah, it was great. One thing I will say is that the Nell chapters are in the first person and the Mrs. Gaskell chapters are in the second person. I'm just saying this because I know that not everybody loves the second person, but please do bear with it, you will get used to it. And actually it makes perfect sense because actually the Gaskell chapters are, they're not in the first person that there's no I, but they are in the first person that it's Nell talking to Mrs. Gaskell, so it has to be you because it's like her talking to her. It's so great, guys. I have nothing else to say. This is fantastic. Please read it, guys. I also read 2 short story collections in December. One was The Mistletoe Murders by P.D. James, which again I read for the Cloak and Dagger readathon. I read one thing by P.D. James before, which was Death Comes to Pemberley, which I did not love, but this I liked a lot more. The first story in the collection, The Mistletoe Murders, I thought was fantastic and I really, really liked and I would highly recommend. The other stories in the collection I felt much less strongly about and don't remember that well, having it been a few weeks since I read it. So I think P.D. James is one of those authors I'm never gonna completely love, but that I would probably like some things by. So I don't know if I'm gonna continue reading much more by her in the future, but I certainly would recommend that one story, The Mistletoe Murder. It was great. And also read Dot Dash by Jonathan Pinnock, which was my TBR Jar pick for the month. Jonathan Pinnock is a writer who was on my Creative Writing Masters several years ago, and I'm slowly working my way through his work. He's written some novels and some poetry and some short story collections. So the premise of Dot Dash from the title is that there is a very, very short story, I mean literally like 3 or 4 lines followed by a longer story of several pages, which is a really, really nice like structure actually. I think my favourite 2 were Return to Cairo and Farewell Symphony, which were just both absolutely beautiful, wonderful stories. I then read 2 books for younger readers this month. One was Slaves of the Mastery by William Nicholson, which Nick and I listened to on audiobook. We've actually been listening to it for quite a few months now. I've been working through it quite slowly, but I really, really enjoyed this one. We listened to the first book in this series, The Wind Singer, back in September and October, I think, and followed on with the second book, which I much preferred, I think, to the first book actually. The first book is quite fairy tale-esque and this felt more like a fully developed fantasy world, and it was really, really interesting. It tells the story of the Hath family, 3 children and their parents, and what happens when their kind of home city is invaded by a outside threat called the Mastery, who take on this city and all their people as slaves and kind of bring them across the country. I found it really, really interesting and compelling. There were a lot of like really interesting issues and ideas brought up here. I think William Nicholson writes brilliantly about like weird systems of government. I don't know, that sounds quite complicated, but the way he kind of explores power and methods of ruling is really, really interesting. Definitely a really interesting read, and I would highly recommend the series. I'm looking forward to reading the 3rd book at some point as well. Then I also read Arsenic for Tea by Robin Stevens. This is a middle grade mystery book. This is the 2nd in the series. The first is Murder Most Unladylike. And this again I read for the Cloak and Dagger Mystery Christmas Readathon. I love this series so much. They are such good fun. They are a series about 2 children who solve mysteries in the 1930s. Arsenic for Tea is so fun and so engaging and just fantastic. Just such an enjoyable read. Definitely one I would recommend. Finally, I have 2 books to talk about which I read for work. So I actually read 5 books for work this month, but as I mentioned earlier in the video, 3 of those are unpublished books that I can't talk about yet, but I do have 2 backlist books I read for work which I can talk about. So in general, what I'm going to do whenever I read a book published by Zaffa, which is the publisher I work at, I'm going to talk about the book, but I'm not exactly going to review them. I'm going to mark them all as read on Goodreads, but I'm never going to rate them on Goodreads. They'll never feature in my favourite books of the year or anything like that, just because I don't feel that would be really fair when they're books published by the publisher where I work. So this is Shelter by Sarah Franklin. This is a historical fiction book set in the Forest of Dean during the Second World War, and it follows 2 main characters. One is Connie, who is a lumberjill, so she is a female lumberjack. She's chopping down trees for the war effort. And the other character it follows is Sepe, who is an Italian prisoner of war stationed in the Forest of Dean. And it kind of looks at both of their lives, their backstories prior to this point, and the kind of complicated and unlikely friendship that develops between them. It's a really, really different look at the Second World War, and I really enjoy Second World War literature that looks at slightly different aspects of the Second World War, and also that looks at 2 characters from different opposing sides in the Second World War. For example, I think if you liked The Dynamite Room by Jason Hewitt, or if you enjoyed All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Dewar, I think you'd really like this too, because it has a kind of similar feel. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one. It was a great read and one I would recommend. Then the other Zaffa backlist book I read for work is Lost for Words by Stephanie Butland. This tells the story of Loveday Cardew, who works in a bookshop in York. She doesn't have any family, she doesn't have very many friends. Pretty much her only friend is the boss of the bookshop, and she very much lives in books and lives a very solitary life. And then she meets a man called Nathan, and the book kind of follows her evolving relationship with him, and meanwhile sort of delving back into her past and why she has come to lead the life that she does. This book definitely is filled with a love of books, and not just of like stories, but also of books as physical objects and the kind of safety of the bookshop in many ways for Loveday. And if you like books about books and books about bookshops, this is definitely one I would recommend. So that is it. That is everything that I read in the month of December 2018. Please let me know if you've read any of the books I mentioned and what you thought of them. So that's fine.